Hey, this is Marketplace Tech Bytes. It's our weekly review of some of the big stories making headlines in the industry, and maybe some you might have missed. I'm Meghan McCarty, Carino. This week, the Senate hears from AI insiders about the need for regulation. Instagram introduces Teen Accounts program, and Apple's AirPods now double as hearing aids. I am joined now by our regular contributor, Burks from Collab Capital. Hey, Jewel, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
And as always, we're going to kick things off with our Bite of the Week. This is a number that gives us some insight into the week's big stories. So, Jewel, what is your number?
So the Bite of the Week this week is 3. And that is the number of years that experts believe we are away from AGI, or artificial general intelligence.
Right. So we heard this from experts at a Senate subcommittee hearing on Tuesday about kind of oversight of artificial intelligence. That subcommittee hearing included folks like Margaret Mitchell, formerly of Google, William Saunders, formerly at OpenAI, David Evan Harris at UC Berkeley, and Georgetown's Helen Toner, who gave us that kind of 3-year wake-up call for when we might realistically expect AGI, which is sort of like the scary sci-fi movie version of artificial intelligence. It's capable of everything a human is or more. Let's hear from her at that hearing.
That technology will be, at a minimum, extraordinarily disruptive, and at a maximum could lead to literal human extinction. And these systems are affecting hundreds of millions of people's lives, even in the absence of scientific consensus about how they work or what will be built next. So I would argue that a wait-and-see approach to policy is not an option.
Cool. Literal human extinction, just a little bit of that. I mean, what did you make of some of these remarks?
You know, I thought that Helen and Margaret and William, they really were all sounding the alarm to make sure that everyone understands that this is really happening. We think about it as, far, maybe years and years in the future, but 3 years was kind of the end of the timeline. They were really saying 1 to 3 years is when we can expect AGI. And they were really centering in on the fact that a lot of the large corporations, Google, OpenAI, are not doing what they need to be doing to protect all of us from that scary eventual future. As noted, several of these folks were formerly at Google, at OpenAI, et cetera, and didn't feel comfortable with how these companies were protecting and thinking about privacy and security and all of these things. And so they are really wanting to sound the alarm because they need and believe that we need to have more intervention from policymakers on this.
Right. We've seen at companies like Google and OpenAI some pullback around safety and ethics teams over the years. William Saunders of OpenAI, formerly, he noted that, security was not prioritized at the company, kind of in its haste to get products out the door. It was maybe, rushing things in a way that could lead to some big problems. I mean, but what are some of the tensions when it comes to the federal government or even states stepping in to regulate AI and some of these theoretical risks at this point?
There's a lot of tension. I mean, if you think about it, these are corporations. And one of the things that was noted in the hearing is that there's somewhat of a race to the bottom. They're all trying to find and figure out how to create the best solutions, but also make the most money. And there is tension in this when you think about ethics and all of the privacy concerns, all of the security concerns, all the transparency concerns. All of that costs money to have the teams, the associated teams, to manage that and the reporting around that. And so they were calling for things like making sure that there's protection for whistleblowers at these organizations, that there's direct lines of communications to point persons on the policy side. They were providing some really what seemed to be relatively simple solutions to some of the problems that have been outlined. But the problem also is that these organizations and large corporations don't really have the right incentives to implement some of these things. So it's going to take policy in order to make sure that all of these things happen.
Right now, the risks of artificial general intelligence are maybe not too far off in the future, but are still in the future. We are seeing some states, California this week, Governor Gavin Newsom signed some AI related bills having to do with regulating things like AI deepfakes in politics. I mean, what are you hearing from folks about, kind of the regulation and some of the harms that are already happening in the real world?
Yeah, we're seeing it already. I mean, we're deep in election season and we're seeing AI kind of take over when it comes to social media, deep fakes, bots, really influencing how people's perception of the candidates is even going. And we think about from a celebrity standpoint, we saw a few weeks ago Taylor Swift say that she wasn't putting out some of these messages that had her face associated with them. So there's a lot happening and a lot that we need to wrap our hands around when it comes to what people are able to produce and consume with AI, and how that relates to folks' identity and what they actually want their face on. So there's a lot happening in this space. And luckily, there are a lot of companies that are startups even that are looking to address some of these problems.
All right, now onto some self-regulation, maybe an effort to head off government regulation. This week, Meta announced new teen accounts, which include features like defaulting minors' accounts to private, adding more parental controls, things like automatic sleep mode during night hours. I mean, Meta is clearly responding to growing calls by parents and policymakers to mitigate harms to young users. But Jewel, do you think that these moves will be enough to kind of silence critics of social media?
Well, they're not enough to silence critics. As these changes were announced, I think parents and policymakers alike were saying they didn't go far enough. But the folks at Instagram are saying, this is a step in the right direction. They're continuing to make adjustments and changes as we go. But I think it's encouraging that there are steps that are being taken to really make sure that teens are safe and that there are ways in which parents can have a little bit more control over what their teens can access.
I mean, of course, in order for these features to really be effective, kids and parents have to use them. Do we have a sense that, Meta can actually enforce this, can verify who is a kid and who is an adult?
I think that's probably the weakest part of the announcement. There aren't really strong ways to verify. They're talking about some identification using IDs and AI even to help with some of the verification. But kids are probably going to be even more incentivized to find ways around the methods. So they're going to have to continue to work on how can they actually verify who's a teen, who's an adult, make sure that people aren't kind of circumventing the prevention methods that they put in place.
Right. This week, we also saw the House of Representatives move forward with a version of the Kids Online Safety Act, which has already passed the Senate. This imposes what's called a duty of care on social media platforms, though it looks like the House version slightly weakens what was in the Senate version. But I mean, basically, this could make these platforms liable for certain harms to young people. What are you hearing about what this could mean for the industry?
Well, I think everyone is now on high alert. I'm sure Instagram and all of the social media companies have teams of people now in Washington, D.C., trying to figure out how to get these solutions that are right for audiences and also make sure that they're meeting their business objectives. It's always a tightrope that they're going to have to walk. But I think overall, because there's been so much pressure for the general public and particularly for young people, I'm hopeful that these changes mean that they can be safer online.
Now for the Apple news of the week. Of course, we've been following all the new hardware releases that roll around every September. Of course, the new iPhone 16, which apparently is not selling in pre-sales as well as Apple might have hoped. But this week brought an announcement about another device, the AirPods Pro 2. They are getting some new functionality via a software update. The FDA just approved their use as hearing aids. Jewel, how does this kind of fit into what we see Apple doing in terms of adding accessibility functions to its devices?
I think this is actually a really exciting update for Apple. They have already in the past been making a move to make their products more accessible to everyone. And actually, some of the hearing aid functionality has already been a part of the iPod, the headphones.
Hmm.
But this move really expands accessibility. And if you think about it, there are 30 million Americans who have some degree of hearing loss. But unfortunately, only 1 in 6 of them are able to actually access hearing aids, whether it be because of the cost of them, stigma associated with wearing hearing aids. And so bringing this to a product like the iPod is really, bringing the accessibility and making it so that more people can actually afford it, so that they can actually hear. And, they're putting a lot of features into it to make it so that it really brings this to the masses of folks who have difficulty hearing.
Right. It's been, just a couple of years since the FDA first approved over-the-counter hearing enhancement devices. Apple's obviously not the first kind of consumer company to jump in here, but it does seem like Apple moving into this market might have a big effect. I mean, in terms of, the accessibility, in terms of the stigma, of course, you see people walking around with AirPods all the time to kind of be using it as a hearing enhancement device seems like a natural, step.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. And for Apple's, what they do, it's also an incredible way for them to capture data. If you think about having one of the cool features is that they're going to allow people to take a hearing test, very quick, maybe 5-minute test. And that is going to give them so much information about their customer base in terms of their hearing. And also they're able to implement changes in the environment. So they can adjust for if you're, in a loud concert or, outdoors. They can make adjustments. So there's some preventative nature in that. So there's a lot that's coming with this release that I think will be super beneficial. And I'm looking forward to it personally as someone who I think may have a little bit of hearing loss. So I'm excited to see how the AirPods help me in that regard as well.
Yeah, seriously, as someone that spends all day wearing earphones, I'm very conscious of, all of my hearing health and all that stuff. So exciting development. Jewel Burks Solomon with Collab Capital. So good to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. And thanks to all of you for joining us for Marketplace Tech Bytes Week in Review. Jesus Alvarado produced this episode. I'm Meghan McCarty Carino. This is APM.